Thank you. About 2 hours ago, I was trying to think, how can I get out of this? But I'm glad I did. And I'm glad that you all came, because actually a lot of this kind of conversation feels very lonely. So it's really inspiring to see that so many people are actually interested in this topic. So I'm going to get into sort of where I want to go with this. But to start it off, I just want to frame this idea of psychosis and what the dominant view is, or the kind of messages that people get when they have a so-called psychotic experience. And that's that people are told that they have problems in their brains and chemical imbalances. Y'all probably encountered that through advertising or through getting diagnosed yourself. And people are told that they have a brain disease. Usually they're told they have things like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And the solution for that is often hospitals. If you're having a rough time, it's red pills, yellow pills, blue pills, white pills, mix the red pills with the yellow, all that kind of stuff. And if the pills don't work, take more pills. And the focus is really just on eliminating symptoms, and people are told that they need to embrace or accept this story about their experiences. In fact, if you don't accept it, that's seen as a symptom of your illness. So in other words, Stephen, you have schizophrenia. No, I don't. Oh, see, you're lacking insight. That's part of the schizophrenia. So that's the kind of current narrative that's everywhere. It's in academic institutions, it's on TV, it's all over the internet, and it's what you're likely to encounter. So I want to make the claim today and try and sort of make my case that psychosis, as we think of it, is actually a process that has an ecological function, by which I mean actually has a function in nature, and that is actually ecologically valuable, that is valuable to nature. So a little bit about me. In the beginning, can you tell which one is me? I suppose I had my head in the clouds. Okay? That worked for a while, but later on, I ended up in psychiatric institutions. And this is a hospital note that about me. So in my mid-20s, I was in hospitals, I got the diagnosis, I got all of the sort of story. And a lot of that was very external. It was people kind of focused on what was wrong with me and telling me things about my life. It didn't really get on the internal side. What I felt internally was this. This is a clear-cut forest. This is a still from a movie called If a Tree Falls. Great movie. If you've ever have any of you ever stood in a clear-cut forest? We're standing in one now, but actually stood in a clear-cut after they've taken down old growth. Has anyone ever done it? It's the kind of immensity of deprivation and sadness that exists there is horrible. And so that's what I was feeling. And that story didn't really get at that. So I did a lot of soul searching. And eventually, this is what I found. And, I found this incredible, beautiful, awesome, interconnected, mind-blowing planet. I spend a lot of my life living outdoors now. This has sort of been my umbilical cord towards living all right. So, when I was 19, and actually I was in Boulder, Colorado, because I went to college here, I had an out-of-body experience. So I was lying in my dorm bed in Willville. They still call it Williams Village. And all of these dreams I had had all my life started replaying for me. And I was literally re-inhabiting them, dreams I had long forgotten. And what was different about it at this moment was I could see how the dreams connected to each other. It was patterns, and I was like, oh my God, it makes sense. At that moment, I was sort of grasping with the profundity of it, and I literally left my body, and I found myself in outer space. See, I can't say this to anybody. I mean, saying this to a room full of people from Boulder, I feel like, people might... Yeah, you were in outer space. And this is what I saw. I literally saw the planet turning. And I had that for about 3 seconds. I saw that. And I felt the most incredible peace and sense of understanding. I felt this kind of almost ineffable thing. And then I zoomed back in my body and I woke up and I was in a fucking dorm room. So what I did not do with that experience, I did not go to these guys. These are the authors of mental illness that kind of create the story that I showed you at the beginning. These folks wrote the current Diagnostics and Statistics Manual, which is the book that basically defines for our culture what is ill and well in terms of a mind. Does anyone know how they make those decisions? Because it's big stuff, like this is ill, this is well. Does anyone know how they make it? Consensus. They vote. Yes, they vote. So they don't look at, it's not like they found mental illness in the brain or anything. They just literally vote. And this is why you end up with things like post-menstrual dysphoria disorder that's now in there, mathematics disorder, all kinds of good stuff. And you can create a mental illness too, because when they were writing that book, they actually asked, this is from their webpage, they asked the public to submit suggestions for new disorders. So if you were like mad at your partner, you could just write down their characteristics and be like, this is a mental illness. So let's play Name That Mental Illness. Had I gone to that group of people, this is a list of symptoms that I found. Profound distortion in a person's perception of reality. I'm seeing images, hearing sounds, feeling sensations, but they're not. Rapid, intense emotional swings, definitely had those. My sense of time and self is altered. Yeah, I'm in the universe. Inability to discern fantasy from reality. It was certainly like fantastical. What mental illness might I get if I explain that experience? And what would these symptoms, what might they... Psychosis, yeah. Or schizophrenia or bipolar, right? So I didn't do that. And ironically, this is actually a list of symptoms for taking hallucinogens. And I want to point that out because the experiences that are seen as psychosis very closely parallel the symptoms of taking hallucinogenic drugs. So indeed, I had eaten hallucinogenic drugs that night. And and I was really wondering if my experience was valid, because I was like, was it just drugs? I came from the South, and there's not really the far out thinking. So I went to my philosophy of religion professor, and what he said to me was sometimes you need a microscope to see an atom. And I took that to mean that, the drugs were a microscope, but I saw something that was real. That was an incredibly validating response that allowed me to take that experience that was pretty out there and integrate it into myself. So what did I see that evening? I want to kind of get into a little bit of ecology. And the reason why I want to get into it is because the way we think of the mind is in this context, right? It's in a context right now. And I'm curious about what is the mind in ecological thinking. What I think I saw that night is what scientists now call Gaia, right? Gaia theory. And that's, scientists will say that the Earth is a self-regulating system, that literally the rivers you see, the forests, the mountains, co-evolved with life. They were feeding back onto each other. It used to be that people thought, it's a static Earth and life evolves in it. But now it's sort of seen as that life is co-evolving together. But where they stop short is very few scientists will say that this self-sustaining system is intelligent. And very few will say that it's meaningful, or I don't know of any that will say that it has a consciousness. I disagree. I think what I saw was a creature that's alive and that has a consciousness, that has a will, has feelings, has, all of the good stuff. So how could that be that Earth has a consciousness? Well, if we look at wasps, we might be able to find a good argument for this, because wasps have very small brains. And no single wasp can build this nest, right? You put 10 wasps together, they still can't build it. But once you reach a certain threshold, 50, 60, 70 wasps, they start self-organizing and collaborating to create an incredibly complex structure. Termites do this, ants do this, a lot of animals and insects do this. And so what physicists call this is an emergent property. And what that means is that literally putting all of these wasps together creates a larger consciousness, which then directs the wasps. And there's no leader, there's no Trump wasp, out there doing that. They just do it. So one way we might think of the Gaian system is that there's an emergent consciousness that exists from all of the life interacting together. And you might have experienced this if you've ever been to India and seen traffic moving. Yeah, right? There's no traffic rules. And I can't figure out how bodies aren't just strewn everywhere and wrecks are everywhere. And it might have something to do with this kind of larger intelligence going on. So looking at this kind of Earth system, this creature, I want to kind of dive into a few of the parts of it. And wild means willed. And I love that the idea that something is self-willing. And I want to just show you this clip about intelligence on our planet. And this is Michael Pollan, who is narrating it. It's just a couple minutes.
My name is Michael Pollan, and I've been writing about plants for a long time, and have been a gardener for an even longer time. And when I learned about this new field called plant neurobiology, I was immediately intrigued, because plants don't have brains and they don't have neurons, so what could this possibly mean? So much of our difficulty in understanding plants traces to the fact that they exist in a completely other time dimension than we do. They seem still, they seem inactive, just because they're moving at a different scale than we are. And so time-lapse is a way to close the gap between the plant's time scale and our own time scale. But as soon as you do that, you begin to see the plant for what it is, which is an agent of its own fate and able to sense its environment and move in a certain direction. And as soon as you look at plants in time-lapse, you gain a new respect for them and what they can do, and that they are much more active. This video of the single plant reaching for the pole is striking for a couple things. Watch the leaves as the thing goes on. The leaves look very kind of clenched and tight, and they too are working hard to help the plant reach its goal. But as soon as the hook of the tendril reaches the pole, watch how they change their behavior. Instead of looking so strained and strenuous, they look like they're relaxing. They look very happy all of a sudden. And the other thing to look at is the nature of the motion and how effortful and striving it is. Basically, the bean plant grows a couple centimeters and throws itself over and over again with very good aim. It reminded me of someone with a fly rod casting repeatedly to hit a spot on a river. In the second video, we see two plants, bean plants, and they're competing for the same pole. And one of them gets the edge and is growing a little bit more quickly. And as soon as it makes contact, the other one seems to lose heart and suddenly stops aiming at the pole, which has been taken in some sense, and starts reaching in other directions behind the pole. You have to look carefully to see this, but it's reaching back in space. And does that repeatedly, but there's nothing there. It's very sad, and there's nothing there for it to hold on to. And eventually, it just gives up in defeat. But somehow this plant is aware of its environment and is working really hard, striving to get to that pole. Now, words like striving and looking and knowing and noticing all are metaphorical in the case of plants, and we should be skeptical of this, of mood and attitude in plants. But it sure looks that way when you look at these videos.
So So I would argue that we don't need to be skeptical, that that plant really it does have mood and emotions and is striving. And what's amazing too when you watch those plants, when they're coming from the center of the room, they don't know where that pole is, and yet they gravitate towards it. And people have no idea how this actually happens. They know plants have 20, 25 different senses. Maybe it's an echolocation kind of thing going on, but how does it know its environment that well? Plants are a tobacco plant. A caterpillar will eat a tobacco plant, and they've taken a recording through a radio of a caterpillar chewing, just a sound recording, and played it for a tobacco plant. And the tobacco plant, when it hears that, releases a chemical that that gets picked up by other tobacco plants to warn them that caterpillars are in the area. Now, people think plants don't have ears. I mean, how does it do that, right? They've measured plants screaming when they're cut. I hate to say this to the vegetarians. When you mow grass and you smell that wonderful smell, that's a chemical stressor coming from grass saying, I'm dying. So plants have a kind of intelligence. And animals, of course, do too, but so do bacteria, all the way down to the smallest level. So one of the properties of a Gaian system is that a forest acts as a creature, and then all the individuals in the forest act as creatures too, as beings, as living beings. And you can see, I took this in an old-growth forest in Washington, that this hemlock is literally sharing the roots with the cedar tree. Now, this kind of collaborative relationship, I think, is in a lot of ways lost on our culture because you don't see this in second growth forests and newly growing forests. This is what happens when you allow a forest or an ecosystem to mature enough, to become intelligent enough. They start hooking up. So when you go down into the root system, there's this stuff called mycelium. And mycelium can be miles long, and it's alive. And it's found in all ecosystems across the world, except for water-based ones. And through these little tiny threads, different organisms are passing on information to each other. So they've done experiments where they've taken a tall tree that's collecting sunlight and using that to eat carbon dioxide, which is amazing. And they've put, a tarp over that tree. Now, if you put a tarp over that tree, you shut down photosynthesis, so that tree cannot make sugars anymore. And yet, they found that the tree maintained the same levels of glucose, of sugar. So they were like, how do they do that? Well, it turns out that the neighboring trees were able to sense that their sister over there, was no longer making sugar. They can sense it because these mycelium is giving information. And they sent glucose through these networks to the tree. So you have these incredible collaborative relationships. And if you go smaller and you look at cells are collaborative relationships as well. You have the origin of complex life came because two tiny single-celled organisms, bacteria, came together and merged. And one of them became what we call mitochondria. It's right there in the cell. It ended up powering the other one, and the other one gave it protection. So you have collaboration down to the level of the cell, and when you go smaller, this is a molecule, these are atoms, you have it there too. That life is because atoms are able to bond together. It's stuff coming together, collaborating, often for mutually beneficial reasons. And so when you zoom back out, there's sort of a design in nature. There's a kind of intelligence behind the design. And you can see the sort of patterns. You can see it on my hand with the leaf. And if you look at the whole Earth system, there's this kind of metabolism going on. So I'm going to read you just a paragraph about this salmon. This salmon was born in this thin creek. When she was 2, she swam 300 miles west. Over jagged rocks, through whimsical currents, she found her way to the ocean. Upon arrival, she metamorphosized her body to be seaworthy. For 5 years she roamed the Pacific, swallowing and housing its nutrients. Then she found her way back to the same tributary and again swam 300 miles, this time upstream, this time with oceanic strength. She returned to the exact place of her birth, dug in a gravel nest, and laid eggs. Shortly thereafter she perished, her work done. Now the crawdaddies eat her flesh, and when no one is looking, a black bear will pull her into the forest and finish her. As her remains scatter across the soil, they provide oceanic nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus for the trees. She nourishes the plants. Without salmon, whose DNA is found all over old-growth forests, none of it would exist. Like a magician, a prophet, she made trees from water. So when you start to look at the global scale, elements like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus are moving through animals and through plants, are being recycled constantly. You can almost see it like a digestive system. You can almost see it like lungs breathing. And so a property of this system, so if there's a global consciousness, is it dictating what we do? And I don't think so, because we don't dictate what our livers do. Unless you're like a serious meditator, you can probably figure that one out. And the reason why we don't is it would take way too much energy to be focused on all of that. And if you want to have a system that is diverse, you want to give the parts free will. Because this cat, this is my old cat, this cat will figure out in its local environment what it needs and what to do better than a top-down consciousness. So all these species that we see have free will to alter their environments, which then alters them, then to alter them, to try and create the most diverse, kind of resilient niche. And I just, without going too flaky, I just want to say that a part of this system, I think, is love. And you can see, I took this picture in Australia where the sun is over here. And this tree grew some branches towards the sun, which makes sense, right? It's called tropism. They grow towards the sun because they want to get sunlight. But look what else it did. It grew some branches over to its neighbor, who's hanging out behind the brick wall. Since I've been paying attention to this stuff, I notice it everywhere. Watch how trees are holding each other, growing into each other. So, the last point I want to make about this Earth system is that biodiversity is how it stays resilient. The Earth has lived through massive, massive trauma and massive extinction events. And the way it's been able to survive is it has so many diverse forms in so many areas that it's able to keep alive through that. So biodiversity is a property of nature that's important. And I would argue neurodiversity, diversity of mind, follows the same thing, is an important property. And the key is diversity doesn't mean a thing unless it's connected. It's only when you have the relationships between a flower and a bee and the pollinating and the nectar, the relationship is what actually makes it valuable. Okay, so thinking about this Earth consciousness and Earth system, I want to start to bring it back to, well, how does psychosis kind of happen in that, and what's its function? And this is the wild, this is an old growth forest, this is what the Earth wants to look like, and this is what a lot of the Earth looks like now. And I show this because the way we think about mind and consciousness is shaped in an environment where we've done a whole lot of this. So looking at this picture, if we're going to think about natural and unnatural, what would you say is natural in this picture?
The girl sitting.
The girl sitting? Is it?
Trumpet. Like she's going towards the light.
She's going towards the light. Cool. I dig. So, what's interesting to me and where I've come to with this is that I've started to see it that everything is natural because that television came from the earth, right? This carpet came from the earth. The little girl probably did too. And all the things that we have in this room came from the earth. And so I've stopped making a distinction between natural and unnatural. And what I think is different about today is not that, it's that most of the things that were around are dead. So we used to, and certainly some people still do, I should say that talking about the earth consciousness is not a new idea. Plenty of indigenous cultures hold that belief and have that belief. It's something in my culture that I'm having to discover because I wasn't taught that. But we used to be surrounded by a living world that was communicating, that was networked, that was diversified, aware, there was an awareness, it was willing itself, and there was danger in it, which is actually stimulating, exciting. And the difference is we've converted tons of that. I mean, 98% of the old growth forests are gone. The large fish, 90% of the large fish in the ocean are gone. And we've converted it to dead things. And when you're surrounded by dead things, you're in an environment that is not communicating anymore, that's about lone objects, it's simplified, it's controlled. And I think it's boring. It's George Monbiot, who's a writer, talks about ecological boredom, that he thinks that human beings are meant to be around saber-toothed tigers, meant to be around that kind of thing, and that we're suffering from a kind of ecological boredom. And so how did this happen? Well, part of how it happened is this is René Descartes, who famously said, "I think, therefore I am." I actually did my homework and went and read his writings. I don't recommend them, they're shit. But your book sounded way more interesting. But, in the 1600s in Europe, there was a pushback against religious thinking. And, he was deeply religious, but this was the start of that. It's known as the Enlightenment, not the Buddhist Enlightenment, but the Western Enlightenment. And the basic thesis he put forward was mind is separate from nature. That mind is literally a separate substance. And that took hold in a very dramatic way. It became known as Cartesian dualism. What it allowed when you separate from nature is now we can study nature and we can look at it supposedly objectively. And back then, people would do horrible experiments on humans, on living animals and stuff because they stopped seeing animals and they'd still see people, but animals as being from God. And you start seeing this stuff as objects that we can manipulate, infiltrate, and gain information from. So that was a big philosophical movement that was kind of the necessary tradition or step before doing things like industrialization, before just tearing up everything. So you get Cartesian dualism, and then of course, what learning ends up looking like is this. So the mind's a separate substance. The mind is how we should learn about the mind should be in an environment like this. Again, just all dead, right? A lot of us spend a lot of our lives in that kind of environment learning how to be conscious. And when you do that, I swear I'm getting to the psychosis bit, but when you do this, you end up with this, sort of being normal. Yes. And when you apply this kind of philosophy to nature, you no longer have old growth forests. You do things like cover the entire, this is a rainforest because this is in London. England used to be a rainforest, but you cover it in asphalt, you get some cars, and you do things like you carve out a little plot and you put a tree. And, I, as much as anyone, when I'm walking down the streets of London, I'm like, oh, lovely, a tree. I've come to see this really differently. I actually don't see the difference between a zoo and doing this. These trees want to be connected. They want to be in their natural environment. And it's probably torturous to just do this kind of thing. These lights out there that they have to live with constantly, they're now finding that some trees need to sleep. They droop their branches at night. They can't sleep when they have lights on them like that. So they're staying awake all. They're probably getting psychotic. And yeah. But this is also, I think, how a lot of people conceive of nature nowadays. A lot of people don't have exposure to wild. So we think of nature as this kind of thing. And, okay, so it's in this context that we've created mental health in the mind. And so what it looks like is this. If you've ever been into it, well, first, if you haven't been to a psychiatric hospital, I don't recommend it. It's when you check yourself in, you actually can't check yourself out. It's not like a hotel. And this is a psychiatric emergency room. This was from the Denver Post. They wrote an article saying we need more of this. Trump is doing this now. We need more asylums, right? And I suppose because they published this with their article arguing for more of it, they don't see the horror that exists in that room. This is where you go if you want to kill yourself because you're in so much pain. This is where you go if you're terrified because you're having far out beliefs. This is where you go if you're super ecstatic and think God is communicating for you, with you for a week and you can't go to your job and everyone's worried about you. It probably goes out without saying, but the chances of healing in that kind of space are rare. Now, you can see you're watched 24 hours a day. It's a number, it's not a name. They have leather belts because they will strap you down. The light falls evenly because they don't want anything to hide in shadow. You're watched constantly. They have these, what they call soothing colors. This is all by design. Soothing colors on the wall. I call it vomit, And so that's what you end up with how to treat a wild mind. And of course, you then see, I just did a Google search, and this is what came up for schizophrenic brain, and most of the public thinks that mental illness is a brain disease, right? What they don't show you, you see all these pretty pictures, it looks convincing. They don't show you is that what you're seeing there is not the effects of a so-called disease. What you're seeing there are the effects of taking antipsychotic drugs. And we know this for sure now because we have lots of studies that show this. This is Nancy Andreasen's study. She's a biological psychiatrist. She's all about schizophrenia as a brain disease, but she did this study trying to prove it, right, in the brain that it's a brain disease. And what she found instead horrified her, that it was the antipsychotic drugs that were making people lose mass in their brain. Their brains were shrinking. They controlled for all the other variables, and what they found was that the severity of illness or substance use has minimal or no effects, that it was literally the antipsychotic drugs. And when you have that kind of approach, this is kind of what you see, is that when looking at recovery rates, for instance, with schizophrenia in the last 50 years, everything is going the wrong direction. And with other, bipolar, depression, anxiety, all that kind of stuff going the wrong direction. It's not like they were treating people good in the 40s or 50s, so I don't want to say that. But this is how it's going, at least in the US and in most Western countries that practice modern psychiatry. There's been some really interesting studies that have shown that in countries that don't practice Western psychiatry have much higher rates of recovery for people with so-called schizophrenia. So what I want to say is that this focus on the brain, I think we get this wrong. And the focus, it's as if the starting point is that the brain produces reality. And so it must be broken if your reality is wrong. And what I want to argue is that the brain doesn't produce reality, it actually reduces it. So what happens is you have your senses and you're taking in information, and your brain, the function of that is to take all of that information in and to condense it into a narrative that makes sense and feels stable. It does this through a process called sensory gating. There's lots of data and studies on this kind of stuff. And you can just think in this room right now, Like, you probably haven't been noticing what you're smelling unless someone farted or something, but you haven't been, no, sorry. So you probably haven't been noticing all your senses, but your brain is, but it's not bringing them to consciousness. So the brain interprets reality, it reduces reality. We shouldn't look at it as a production factory. We should look at it that it's actually reducing things. And I'll get into this, but maybe then psychosis isn't reducing reality as much. So coming back to the big picture, if we're going to start thinking about psychosis and what it might be, the first thing I want to say is that plants that make psychosis, that make you psychotic, how many of you have taken those plants before? Come on, it's a friendly room. Oh, Jesus. Have thrived on Earth, literally thrived. There's hundreds of psychoactive plants on the planet in all ecosystems across the world for tens of millions of years, right? So the first thing we can assume is that if that wasn't valuable, those plants would have been eliminated. So the mere fact that we have psilocybin mushrooms and ergo fungus that we make LSD from, and they're everywhere, in ayahuasca, we can assume that they do something that's functional for the earth, that they're wanted by the earth. And so what are they doing? Well, here's some hippies for you. You know, what I want to do is mute this. Mute. So here's some hippies for you. Watch them licking this beetle. These are yellow ants that host this beetle in their colony. This beetle secretes a psychoactive compound that they just love. So they raise the beetle's kids. They create incubator chambers, and they literally allow the beetle to lay eggs in it. They raise the kids. If the ant colony gets invaded, it will save the beetles before it will save its partners. And, you know, I hate to say it, but Nancy Reagan might have been right about drugs being bad for you, because if they have too many beetles and do this too much, the worker ants stop working. And you can get colony collapse. And then, so we got some ants doing that. And here, this is a nice trippy video on the BBC. This is the Amanita muscaria mushroom, which is made famous by Super Mario Brothers. You eat it and you fly. And caribou, reindeer, chipmunks, and squirrels love this. So they eat it primarily in Siberia, although I found one in Tasmania. They're kind of everywhere. And they will eat this and trip. And if one of their young gets killed, say by wolves, while they're tripping because they're not paying attention, they will still go back and eat it. That's how much they love it. Now it's interesting, not every animal in the pack will eat it. So it's y'all in this room that would be in the pack that would eat it, and some don't like to do it. Goats eat psychedelics, moths do it. There's a great book called Animals and Psychedelics if you're ever interested in more of that. So what this suggests is that animals like this, and if you So the way we think about Santa Claus, there's good evidence to think it came from a Siberian story, and you can see Santa's the color of the mushrooms and his reindeer fly. So I think the question becomes, well, what are these animals getting out of psychosis? Now, let me just say, if any of you are psychiatrists, you'd probably argue with me on this point that tripping is the same thing as psychosis. I don't trust a lot of psychiatrists making that, one, because I don't know a lot that have tripped, and two, I don't know a lot that have had psychosis. But if you've ever had any experiences of both, they're damn similar. You're hearing voices, you're smelling colors, you're believing strange things, you feel open to the universe. If you have a bad trip, you feel, demonic possession. All of that's the same kind of stuff that shows up when people are diagnosed with psychosis. So what are these mushrooms, what are psilocybin mushrooms, for instance, doing to the human brain? Well, lots of research is coming out about this. And this is just one study that says psilocybin has recently been demonstrated to have significant clinical efficacy in the treatment of depression anxiety, and addiction that persists for at least several months after only a single therapeutic session. How does this occur? Well, much work has recently been published from imaging studies showing that psychedelics alter brain network connectivity. They facilitate a disintegration of the default mode network. Basically, what that means is that they stop you from doing your defaults. They break habits. They produce a hyperconnectivity between brain regions that allows centers that do not normally communicate with each other to do so. So now you have different parts of your brain communicating for the first time. And that these acute molecular processes also influence gene expression changes. So they change your physiology so that it's going to do something different, which likely influence synaptic plasticity. It just means that it's changing you physically, and facilitates more long-term changes in brain neurochemistry, ultimately underlying the therapeutic efficacy of a single administration to achieve long-lasting effects. The Grateful Dead said all of this in Dark Star a lot better, but you know. So then my question becomes, all right, so psilocybin, and they're having extraordinary results with giving magic mushrooms to people and showing that it's helping people overcome all kinds of things, right? So then, what do these effects, a disintegration of default ways of breaking habits, new communication between brain regions, and change genes, what does that make possible, right? What does it make possible in an organism? So we know that these psychoactive plants impact other plants, animals, fungi, ecoranges, and likely bacteria. I just haven't finished doing my homework on that. The way they impact humans. We know that if you give a plant Valium, it's going to, if you give it speed, we've done that kind of stuff. So if these substances are breaking habits, allowing new ways to communicate, then I think the proper way of looking at them is that they're a tool for nature to evolve and to innovate. And you can see this if you look at psilocybin in the grass range. It's passing psilocybin molecules into the grass range network, and that's stimulating new growth in the roots. So plants have serotonin receptors, animals have them, fungi have them, bacteria have serotonin receptors, and the psilocybin plugs into that receptor, and it allows for new ways of doing things. So, thinking then about psychosis, the original word, the most benevolent translation, is that it's an increase in animating spirit. Psyche means animating spirit. Osis can mean affliction, but it also can mean an increase. And what I want to say is that psychosis is found in every culture across time. Now, I might be wrong at this point, but name me another disease that's found in every culture across time. I can't find one. And what that says to me is if something is found in every culture across time, like music, sex, we don't say sex is well, some people do, is a disease. We say that's a human trait. It's part of what human beings do. And so part of what human beings do is they get psychotic. And so I think of psychosis then, the actual physiological experience, as amplified senses. That what's happening is that those gates, those sensory gates, aren't cutting off as much information, and you're getting more reality coming in. There's a great book called Plant Intelligence and the Imaginal Realm by Stephen Herod Buhner that explores some of this stuff. He doesn't quite get here, but in much more detail, the sensory gating stuff. So that amplified senses is allowing for the organism to think or be anew, okay? Now, I want to separate that experience from the content that someone thinks in their mind when they're psychotic. Because I've worked in peer support for 12 years. I've worked with the people in extreme states for lots and lots of years. And I've seen how painful and terrible, and I want to validate that. I'm not romanticizing and saying this is a beauty. I've had really difficult experiences myself. But if we start saying that some beliefs are delusional, which is what psychiatry says, we're in very dangerous territory, because the majority of Americans believe that a virgin gave birth to the Son of God and that a man stood in front of the sea and parted it. I tend to think an ocean will kick your ass, but it's this belief that people, there's people having all these kinds of beliefs. The difference is, if you believe that a man parted the ocean and that a virgin gave birth to the Son of God, you can still have friends with that belief. There's a place you can go every Sunday and talk about it. There's people that will validate you and say that that's a real experience. You can have community and life around that kind of experience. You don't get that if you feel like that the CIA plugged a camera in your brain. You're left alone. So if we're just going to, I'll throw out a couple of ecological metaphors that we might think about psychosis. One of them is wildfire, that a lot of pine forests and eucalyptus forests need fire to come into the ecosystem. Does anyone know what the fire does?
Basically, like, fertilizes the soil so new forests can rise up.
Good. It fertilizes the soil by burning off the underbrush, the stuff that needs to go away, right? Yeah.
Also, like some seeds need the heat to be able to germinate.
Yes, they won't. Some seeds won't germinate. Some of the cones won't open unless you have this fire. So the fire comes through, and that's the process by which the forest regenerates and becomes something new. If you just look at the forest when it's on fire, it's going to look dangerous, sloppy, terrible, right? And I think that's kind of what we do with psychosis. We look at it at a certain moment. We don't take the long view, and we think, put it out. Put that damn fire out. Ironically, if you put out the wildfire, if you don't allow that forest to burn, it actually becomes more vulnerable to burning down because its underbrush grows up. And now if a fire comes through, it's going to knock it out. So one way we might think of psychosis as a process that's burning off in order to have something new. Another way we might think of it is a fever analogy. That when you have viruses come into your body, sometimes your body will mount a fever. And what that is, your organism, your body, heats up to burn off those bacteria, those viruses. Now, a fever is dangerous. You can die. You can burn up, you can heat up too much. However, if you don't allow that process to happen, the bacteria and the viruses stay. So could it be that psychosis is also a process by which, well, let me frame it this way. When you look at a fever, the fever isn't the problem. The fever is the solution. The problem was there before. Now, the majority of people that get big labels like schizophrenia and bipolar have histories of significant trauma. There's something to be said about that. Could it possibly be that psychosis is a process of exposing things, of exposing pain, of exposing difficult experiences, bringing them out, right? Amplifying them so that somebody can reorganize or rework them. And, I get accused of romanticizing, and I'm just want to show you, this is an Abilify ad with a white middle-aged woman, because they target white middle-aged women. And, if you just take the drug, you end up in the green pastures. When people have accused me of romanticizing, my argument, I actually think we need to romanticize this psychosis more. I can't imagine a more unimaginative, stale, dead-end interpretation than to say it's just a brain disease, we have no idea where it comes from, take the drugs. So romanticizing, I think of as flirting with potential. It's like, oh, we have a romantic connection. We're flirting with potential. That we need to start flirting with some of the potential of this. We don't need to go to where some of the spiritual community has gone and say, everyone's a shaman who's having psychosis. That's, We don't need to go the direction where we start writing everyone's story for them, right? But I do think we have to start just keeping an open mind to the possibilities. So as I wrap up, I just want to show you those magic mushrooms, those psychosis-producing plants are going to be controlled by psychiatry soon. They're doing all the studies, they want them, and they're excited. Thomas Insel, the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health, I just read this interview with him. He's like, we finally found the magic bullet pill, right? So after 150 years of torturing people to stop psychosis, psychiatrists now want to induce it, which is a great irony. And so finally, I think the lessons we can take from this is that the process of psychosis belongs on Earth. It exists across species. It's not going away. There is no eliminating or curing it. Psychosis is a dangerous gift. This comes from the Icarus Project, a community of people rethinking madness. That yes, there's dangerous elements, but there's also gifting elements to it too. That it's a tool of nature, it's not an aberration. It's not something going wrong in the natural systems. And that ultimately people experiencing psychosis, like all people, need community who validate and value that experience. So this is the piece that I've been focusing on for the last 12 years because theory is good, but I also am very interested in the question, when somebody is in a wild state of mind, how can we stay connected and form community around that? And I teach right now a practice called intentional peer support that was developed by Sherry Mead. We train people all over the world in this practice, and it's basically a framework for how to build relationships under any circumstances, including really tough circumstances, suicide, self-injury, alternate reality kind of stuff. We really get into how to stay connected and have community around those kinds of experiences. Okay, y'all. Well, I want to just say one other thing, and then I'll ask if y'all have any questions. I do have a book that I made of photography and writings. I've done some writings on this kind of thing. So I have it for sale for $10 because that's what it cost me to print it. However, if you work with people and you think they would value this, you know, I'll give it to you for free, and you're free to photocopy it. There's articles in there. I just would love for people to take a look and for maybe to have some other ideas. Go hide them in hospitals. I used to do that. I used to go into the hospital. I worked at a hospital. I'd hide brochures behind all of the. Okay, well that's what I got, and thank you so much.